Hello, welcome to In, a series of online conversations with practitioners in the visual arts. In is broadcast by New Local Space, a contemporary art initiative in Kingston, Jamaica, and a subsidiary of audio production house Creative Sounds. This morning, I'm chatting with the core committee of Tilting Axis, a regional meeting focused on the Caribbean visual arts. Our guests today are Annalee Davis, Bynoe, and Mario Caro. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
Thanks for being here. Mario Caro is a researcher, curator, and instructor of contemporary indigenous art. Dr. Caro has published widely on the history, theory, and criticism of contemporary art, is the founding editor of Invisible Culture, an electronic journal for visual culture, and former president of Res Artis, an international network of art residencies. Annalee Davis is a practicing visual artist who works around issues of post-plantation economies by engaging with the landscape of Barbados where she lives. She's a founder and former director of Fresh Milk, a socially engaged arts platform and micro-artist residency program on a modern dairy farm. In February 2015, she co-founded Tilting Axis in an attempt to breach the geopolitical gap between Caribbean territories and reconnect them through alternative forms of critical Caribbeanness and the visual arts. She's the co-founder of the annual regional residency program Caribbean Linked and a part-time tutor in the BFA program at Barbados Community College. She's on the board of Art Magazine and is the Caribbean Arts Manager for the British Council. Bynoe is a curator, visual artist, and writer from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, living and working in Nassau, the Bahamas, where she's serving as chief curator of the National Art Gallery of the Bahamas. Bynoe is co-founder and director of Arc Magazine. As editor and director of Arc Magazine, Bynoe has organized and curated exhibitions across the Caribbean and the diaspora in collaboration with formal and informal art spaces, including Trinidad and Tobago Film Festival, Volta, New York, the Fresh Milk Art Platform, Transforming Spaces, Museum of Contemporary African Diaspora Art, and others. She is co-director of Caribbean Linked, a regional residency program in Aruba, co-director of Tilting Axis, a biannual meeting charting arts activism and nonprofit models of connectivity and sustainability across the region. She is currently conducting research on interdisciplinary practices across the global Caribbean with a focus on new media and photography. Thank you again to the three of you for taking the time to chat with us on the program.
Thank you.
Tilting Axis is now in its fourth year with 3 regional meetings under its belt. I'm going to start the conversation off by simply asking, what is Tilting Axis? And I hope each of you can weigh in on this.
Well, I can start. I'll kick off by saying that Tilting Axis is a roving meeting. It's driven from within the Caribbean and from the perspective of artist-led initiatives. It kind of pivots on a Caribbean axis. And the word tilting suggests action. It's a verb. It's a call to action. So it's this roving meeting that's been happening in and out of the Caribbean that's trying to address concerns in relation to the visual arts sector.
Holly, Mario?
Yes, Deborah, adding to that, I think Tilting Axis also addresses the practical, theoretical, and speculative concerns that we have as visual arts professionals, often working without support within our region. It's a way to build networks, share best practices, increase our capacities, as well as thinking about the legacy of knowledge transfer and how important it is for us to cultivate that within our space.
Mm-hmm. Mario, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, and my interest in contributing to Tilting Axis is the possibilities that it allows for those of us outside the Caribbean and who want to know more about it and engage with it in in a sustainable way. It's an entryway into the region that allows us to kind of an overview of what's current and what's possible in the region.
Mm-hmm. What is the format of Tilting Axis of the meetings so far, and where have each of the meetings taken place?
Well, the first one started at Fresh Milk in Barbados in February of 2015. I should mention that there's a fourth member of this core team who's not with us today, but Tobias Ostrander. And he's been working with us in the last number of iterations. So the first one took place in Barbados, and it was kind of a loose sort of structure, a kind of I think what we would call like an unconferenced kind of structure towards that. And it had a small gathering of people that came in to be able to think about ways in which we could sort of sit at the same table and be aware of what other artist-led initiatives were doing, and think about how we could grow our network and foster our alliances.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, at the first meeting was actually themed and titled Within and Beyond the Caribbean, Shifting Models of Sustainability and Connectivity.
Okay.
And within that meeting, we discussed exhibitions, mobility, and access. The second meeting that happened at the Perez Art Museum in Miami discussed several strategies that we deploy within the region. And I think that we really started to look heavily at policy. And our third meeting, and I know I'm forgetting the 0.5, and we'll probably move back to the 0.5 to flesh it out a little bit as we proceed with the conversation.
Tilting Axis 1.5.
Tilting Axis 1.5,
Mm-hmm.
which was held in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, as a part of the Video Brazil programming in
Mm-hmm.
2015.
So really, there have been 4 meetings, not 3.
Yes, there've been 4 meetings, correct.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And the latest being at the National Gallery in the Cayman Islands, and that was titled Curating the Caribbean, where we discussed the time of exhibitions, the place of exhibitions, the archive, and curatorial practices, wide curatorial practices.
Mm-hmm.
And let me just chime in. I think, if I remember correctly, for the second meeting, the one that second full meeting that happened in Miami, there was also a discussion about education, alternative models of education, right? That I thought was fairly invigorating, at least for me, to hear these different models for teaching art in non-traditional spaces.
Mm-hmm. So maybe you could give us a little bit of an idea of how education could have also been a focus in the same meeting, where policy was also a focus. Like how does the actual meeting take place? In other words, how do all these various issues get addressed in each iteration of the meeting?
Well, I guess it happens in a combination of ways. The first one was quite unstructured. So it really was a kind of like an open platform in a lot of ways. I mean, we did invite people to share some of the programming that they were doing. The second iteration at the Perez Art Museum was a bit more structured in terms of having these kind of panels set up. And then there were these interventions by a number of artists who would present their practice. And then there were these kind of breakout sessions that would allow people to respond to that. The last iteration, I would say, was the more formal of the 3 full meetings that we've had with these 4 panels. And then we had on the third day a kind of a series of breakout sessions. People separated out into different groups to address different things that had come out from conversations with the full audience, to raise things that they wanted to discuss. Mm-hmm. So it's the core team tends to shape some of the ideas, thinking about, this one was about how do we talk about the Caribbean's fragile arts ecology? How do we think about provoking it and buttressing it and enriching it through a curatorial lens? So the core team tends to shape the content and invite people to come in. And it sort of grows from that.
Mm-hmm. I would also say that, and of course, I defer to Annalee and Holly on this, because they're really the ones that, if there's a original core team, I'd say it's the 2 of them. But there's a way in which the core team itself has evolved and grown, right? I mean, I think each one of our hosts has in a way become part of the core team. Mm-hmm. With Tobias Ostrander hosting us in Miami, and Natalie Urquhart now in the Cayman Islands. I think that the four, is it 4 or 5 now? There are 5 of us are now engaged in, planning the future meeting. So there's a way in which there's growth going on in a very kind of organic way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think that is also very essential to its own sustainability. So we don't stagnate as a core. When we move from one iteration to the next, we have new ideas coming in. We have to figure out how to problem solve to work with host institutions. And we get a great understanding of how the local ecology is made up. So we're not, essentially we're not like parachuting in and or looking in from the outside. We have that on the ground support, which really keeps us in context.
Right. And I'll probably get into asking you more about that kind of organizational structure in a little further on in the conversation, and how that, as you're saying, informs the meeting. But first I want to ask how Tilting Axis came into being. Holly, maybe you could start that one off. How did Tilting Axis come into being?
Well, so Annalee and I, we hatch plans. We've sort of been through like the ringer with grant writing. So in 2013, I think after eating, being on our 4th bag of M&Ms, taking a slow cooker to, I don't even remember where we were, Annalee.
It was Caribbean Export, the boardroom of Caribbean Export Development Agency.
To make food, to feed ourselves, and hustling to get this grant done and completed for the ACP, we realized that we were absolutely out of touch with how the current system of granting, that whole system is sort of flawed. And for us, moving through the steps of trying to negotiate our power and trying to figure out how to develop a project that was worthwhile and significant for our space, something that really took into consideration the lack of governmental support and the lack of community support that we have. And working within this emptiness, we wanted to have this thing. So it's birthed out of love and frustration, I think equal parts for me. And I do remember that moment of us saying, you know what, we're not going to do this. As 2 people spearheading informal arts organizations, we aren't going to put forward unnecessary energies to try to do something that in essence is working against us. So we wanted to create something that would work for our space, something that would really attack the belly of the thing that we're in. So Tilting Axis came out of all of that informal conversation. And I think it's really important to understand that the foundation of that is also based on a deep friendship.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
that's critical for the reading of the birth of Tilting Axis.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, many hours of figuring out ways in which we could change, make, contribute to and build on work that has gone before. Also, I think a really strong sense from my perspective of mitigating isolation and recognizing that we're applying to these grants to external organizations that don't necessarily understand maybe the needs, and having this repeat experience of meeting my colleagues in the Brooklyn Museum or somewhere in London or wherever, but not being able to bring us together as Caribbean people on Caribbean soil. And so when, these 5 grants were all rejected, we thought, okay, let's just do this, and we'll do it in the very small wooden space that Fresh Milk has to offer, and we'll just do what we can with what we have, rather than, have a litany of woes and think about what we can't do. Let's just do what we can do, and let's pull all of these fabulous kind of cohorts we have around the region and put them all in one space, and let's look at what we can, how do we mitigate that isolation and feel like we're part of something together.
Yeah. Could each of you weigh in on telling us what the process has been like as the idea for Tilting? I mean, you've sort of touched on it a bit in answering the other questions, but what has the process been like as this idea for Tilting Axis has manifested and developed, and where is it now in its development in terms of the scope, capacity, and reach of the meeting? It's a big question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's for me, it's quite exhilarating. I mean, its growth has included developing something called the Tilting Axis Emerging Curatorial Fellowship. So that, you know, there have been some tangible things that have come out of it that have been really, you know, powerful. So being able to support a young Jamaican curator for the inaugural one, for example, with Nicole Smythe Johnson, has been such a wonderful thing to be able to do with the support of many other people around us. So I think that it feels empowering to when all of these people come together and there's this collective generosity and dedication and interest in pushing things forward in the Caribbean. It feels like a really great thing to be a part of.
Mario, Holly?
Well, yeah, Holly, I'll
yeah, so this is the thing about the Tilting Axis meeting, right? Everybody who shows up, they're interested in the space. I don't think that we are thinking about the cohort as people who don't have that interest. So for me, when we're sitting, when we're meeting, when we're speaking, when we're sharing and exchanging, there's a certain kind of energy, a certain kind of efficiency. I could see, you know, wheels turning, and I could see the bridges being born out of the exchange. And for me, it's really fruitful because we don't get an opportunity to have that encounter very often because, you know, because of geographical issues and the fact that, you know, we don't really have resources to engage in that manner. But the seeds are planted at these meetings and we just watch them bear whatever fruit.
What about the organizational structure of Tilting Axis and how does it inform the meeting? Annalee, you mentioned the Tilting Axis. I mean, you each mentioned the partners. You mentioned Tobias Ostrander from the Paris Art Museum in Miami, Natalie Urquhart from the National Gallery of the Cayman Islands, but you also mentioned the Tilting Axis Fellowship. So, I mean, if you think about it, even just the fellowship, that would require a number of partners to manifest. So what is the organizational structure like, and how does it sort of shape everything involved with the meeting?
Well, I guess the ground floor organizational collaboration is ARC and Fresh Milk, and then Perez came on board and Reza Ortiz, and then the National Gallery of the Cayman Islands for the last iteration. But we've had partners that are also organizations external to the Caribbean, and that has included in the first iteration, we did have support from the Prince Claus Funds, which is in the Netherlands. The Davidoff Art Initiative and the British Council were also involved from the first iteration. So we've had some economic partnership from these entities, and then I guess just our networks contributing, you know, in the shaping of the meeting, but in the actual meeting itself. In terms of the Tilting Axis Fellowship, we then had relations with entities that came out of people who'd come to Tilting Axis and had professional networks with, for example, the CCA Glasgow, the David Dale Gallery and Studios, Mother Tongue. So they then worked with us to support Nicole's time when she was moving through Scotland, and then other relations across the Caribbean when she was moving through Grenada, Suriname, Barbados, Puerto Rico. So it's this sort of, I think, as Mario was saying, a kind of an organic nature to people coming in and out to lend their support when it's needed.
What are the organizations that that the fellowship involved? You mentioned the organizations in Scotland. What are the regional organizations that the fellowship that were involved with that fellowship?
Well, I would say it was the spaces that she connected up with. So in Grenada, it would have been Groundation Grenada, and an alliance that was born out of Malika Brooks-Smith-Lowe. She was went into Tembe in Suriname. She came to Fresh Milk in Barbados, and she connected with Beta Local in Puerto Rico. I'm not sure, Holly, if I'm forgetting anything there.
No, I think you've covered it.
All of them.
And that was an itinerary that she set for herself,
right?
Oh, I see. So part of the fellowship is setting here, or is it something that the fellowship is sort of builds or takes shape organically?
Well,
I think it was part of the application process.
It was part of the application process, the proposal. Okay.
Yeah.
What sort of regional specific issues in the visual arts does TA address at this point? You touched on a few of them. Holly, you mentioned geography. Annalee, you mentioned isolation, mitigating this sort of isolation that practitioners in the visual arts experience in the region. But what are some of the other regional specific issues that the meeting addresses?
For me, I think with my position at the National Art Gallery and somebody who's in the core of Tilting Axis, I think we are now starting to see how curatorial exchanges are possible. So figuring out how to move artists around the region, thinking about professional development, thinking about different ways to make institutions factor in experimentation and getting out of this sort of the narrative of nation building and nation statehood. Tilting Axis applies pressure on me as a curator working for a governmental institution to try to figure out how to, you know, delve deeper within the actual mandate to see how we can stretch what we consider a Caribbean art to be. So for me, that is a very, very specific issue that I will be working on over the next couple of years at the institution.
I mean, I think one of the other things is, and Mario can probably weigh in on this as well, is residencies. So that's something that's growing in the Caribbean. So we were looking at education, exhibitions and programming, but residencies has been important because it's something that allows people to make work or conduct research. So we have been speaking about that as well.
Yes, the mobility of artists and professionals and trying to figure out ways in which they can enrich and have a deeper experience of, you know, really finding the time, finding the encouragement, finding the people, all of the resources needed to pull that best work out of them.
And the residency field has really kind of been very aware of issues like establishing and nurturing long-term relationships with various regions and communities. So you know, this idea of an artist just coming in and then using up resources and you know, and leaving without you know, a sense of responsibility to places is no longer something that that's you know, that's sustainable. And I think a lot of residencies understand that. And so in terms of the Caribbean, I think that that's something that will, in the long run, be very meaningful for a lot of us from the outside, sort of getting to understand the region, but also feeling some kind of responsibility towards it as well.
Yeah. And sustained relationships.
Right.
Can we talk a bit about variations in geography, language, and access across the Caribbean and how this factors in the way the visual arts have developed here in the region, whether you think it's important for Tilting Axis to address this, and how does the meeting address it, if so?
I mean, I think about that there are a lot of things that we share across the Caribbean, but there are things that are quite different. And I do remember when Nicole Smythe-Johnson was speaking at the last Tilting Axis, and she talked about that, you know, she would be critical of the National Gallery of Jamaica for maybe not doing enough until she came to the Southern Caribbean and was moving through countries like Grenada and Barbados that didn't have a national gallery to even push up against. So I think that although there's a kind of a baseline of kind of, you know, similar things, there are some islands that have, for example, a bachelor's degree in the visual arts. There are many that don't in the OECS countries. There are some countries with a national gallery and there's some countries without. So I think that we will we're developing more understanding around the nuances of those differences. And I think that that's important. So we're more sensitive to the context within which you're working and those variations.
And I also think when we're conceiving of these meetings, we very much take into consideration how we can make the fields equivalent. So thinking about the French West Indies, the Dutch West Indies, the Anglophone and the Hispanophone Caribbean, and ensuring that there's like balance and visibility from each of these sections so that they can be represented.
Yeah. So that brings us into the next question, which is what the representation at Tilting Axis is like from across the Caribbean. I mean, what kind of representation would someone expect to see at the meeting?
Well, we are always really conscious about trying to address, make sure there's presence from all linguistic areas of the Caribbean. And I think that's important because there's been this sort of colonial imposition about division across language. Mm-hmm. And while there are real challenges working in a multilingual space, I think that it's critical for us to have representation from the Dutch, French, Spanish, and English Caribbean. And it's not always equal, or it never is, but we're very conscious of reaching out to our colleagues in all linguistic areas across the Caribbean.
Yeah, and it probably could never be, right? I mean, just out of necessity. Yeah. I mean, we conduct the meetings in English. We're conducting this interview in English. So there are these kinds of, already
built-in
biased approaches to it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And how many people attend Tilting Axis? What's the attendance like?
Yeah, so I think for our first meeting we had around 35 people. Mm-hmm. With Annalee, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we had a local contingent of 10.
Yeah.
Barbados.
Yeah.
So that would be a 10-25 split. In Miami, it grew. We had around, I think, upwards of 80 people.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
And for the meeting in Cayman, I think we topped off at around 72.
Mm-hmm. And what about Tilting Axis 1.5?
So that was basically a presentation with Ngoni Fall, Solange Farkas, Annalee and I, and Maria Lena. Mm-hmm. And they had the talk in one of the rooms at Seski Pompe. And I think we had about 20 or 30 people come out to view.
Okay, great. Annalee,
and for me, I just, the 1.5 was interesting. Even it was unfortunate that I couldn't attend because I had planned on doing it. But it's a moment in which, Tilting Axis is outside the Caribbean and, is intersecting in really radical ways. I mean, and Gone and Fall, for example, I'll just cite her as an example because she is active both in Africa and in Europe. She's she's very global in the way and she approaches things, and yet she was able to contribute not only to the first iteration of Tilting Axis, but also this 1.5, in a very in a way that really provided a good perspective, both for folks within the Caribbean and outside as well.
What was her contribution? Can you give us just a little idea of that?
Well, she came up, one of the things that I remember very clearly were kind of strategies for exhibition or for exhibiting, for getting artists to be able to show outside the region. And one of them was to sort of do a skip from the Caribbean into Africa that could possibly lead to Europe or other kinds of, she was very strategic in thinking about ways in which one could kind of utilize these kind of vectors that were being opened up to benefit artists and their possibilities for mobility and exhibiting outside the region.
Annalee, you've said before that you were inspired by, speaking of Video Brazil, you were inspired by Video Brazil's biannual symposium. And the objective of that symposium, the stated objective of that symposium is to engage with the Global South. Do you see Tilting Axis as sharing in that objective of engaging with the Global South? Is Tilting Axis inward or outward facing, or both? Why?
I would say that it's both. I mean, the Video Brazil's symposium was fantastic, very well organized. It also has been around for 30 years. It's one of these few entities in South America that has sort of survived 3 decades of military dictatorships, and it's, you know, it's still working. And I think its interest in working south of the equator has been, you know, a very good strategy. I think that we're trained in the Caribbean to very much look north, and that there's a lot of synchronicity, you know, with colleagues in the global south. So I think that that's a really important thing for us to keep in mind as we shape Tilting Axis. And I think, you know, it has to be inward because we have to address our own situation, and it has to be outward because the Caribbean is also it's a kind of a borderless space, in that the Caribbean is in Amsterdam and it is in Toronto, and it's all over. So we have a responsibility to Caribbean diasporic community who might often in the global north feel quite marginal, and they want to connect in, you know, with what's happening at Tilting Axis. And so I think we're trying to sort of harness the world's gaze to shine a light on contemporary visual practice that's happening in the Caribbean, and to form alliances with the global south. So I think that it's both.
You've also mentioned, Annalee, that you participated in a panel at Video Brazil titled "The Politics of Hospitality." What does the politics of hospitality mean exactly, and how does Tilting Axis engage this idea? I would love to hear this from all three of you. I know that it started off with your personal experience, but if it resonates with anybody else, please feel free.
Yeah, I mean, I think that even more so, I think the moment that we're living in feels inhospitable, right? So there are lots of conversations that are happening globally where people don't feel that we're living in a hospitable space. And so there are not a lot of moments where we can feel safe and valued, and that there are moments for meaningful, deep conversation. And I think that the Tilting Axis and even the practice of residencies are spaces that push up against this, the fortification of national borders that make people feel unwelcomed. I mean, there's still difficulty for many artists, for example, to get visas to go from one space to another. So for me, the politics of hospitality is about creating a gracious space that receives and is open to people working in the arts, which I think are almost people at risk in the Caribbean because it can be such a hostile environment for people working in the arts. So, you know, it's about creating a space that welcomes and brings together, and yeah, it's a hospitable space.
Anybody else wants to answer on that one, or?
Yeah, I mean, I'll chime in terms of, you know, the relationship between hospitality and residencies, in you know, explicit, right? This is what a residency should think about, is how to be a proper host. But beyond that, I mean, I think you know, all cultures you know, have developed various protocols of hospitality, and my work with indigenous cultures, those are often very formalized protocols. You know, there are often ceremonies that are performed, you know, when one engages a different group, and so the anticipation of the other is always there in you know, in the forefront. And I think all cultures, Western, non-Western, do this. There's a difference, though, if your expected engagement with the other is a military one. You know, when when Europeans ventured out, you know, they usually traveled in heavily armored ships and so on. So, I mean, just anticipating that engagement and thinking about how to develop protocols that you know, are welcoming and that are that anticipate an outcome of that engagement that is worthwhile. You know, so you know, just in very general terms, I think, you know, it's a really an important part of what we do in the residency field.
Holly, you are one of, if not the most active curator from the Caribbean, living and working within the Caribbean. You've worked in, and certainly the English-speaking Caribbean. You've worked in a curatorial capacity on projects both within the region, such as the new media exhibition in the Trinidad and Tobago Film Festival, ARC Magazine, Caribbean Linked, and your current post as chief curator at the National Art Gallery of the Bahamas. You've also curated outside of the region, introducing voices from the Caribbean into larger conversations. What is your curatorial position? And so I'm going into more like nuanced territory here. What is your curatorial position? How has this work informed the molding of Tilting Axis from your perspective, and also the ethos of Tilting Axis?
I would say as a curator, I am always thinking about ways in which, or ways to deal with the contentious histories of this space and how these conditions and traumas continue to be realized in our contemporary moment. As you know, as a post-colonial subject, or as post-colonial subjects, as makers, thinkers, agents, and doers, how can my practice align with the largeness of this moment while working to pull out ways to be useful and purposeful in my community? In this way, there's little disconnect, and I find it like very informative, as opposed to how I was working 3-4 years ago. I was working in a really sort of quick way, making short but very loud noises, connecting artists, themes, trying to situate myself within the markers of literature to ground me. And the cultural synthesis within art practice is the thing that continues to rescue me. And as I observe the way mediums shift, how different artists are locating themselves politically in relation to gender, power, hierarchies, radicalism, just being informed by how they are reacting and how they are integrating all of these different dialogues into their social practice keeps me very motivated. And looking back at the work that I've done and looking at the work that I continue to do, I struggle to come to terms with the ways in which our fluidity meets and matches the weight of all of these legacies. And since moving to the NAGB, I've had some time to think about experimentation, research, of slowing down the process, of thinking about the wider community, service and language, and how institutions function and my role within it. So whenever I am in conversation with these 4 amazing people who I'm attached to, I have to question that curatorial integrity, that observational integrity, and that truth, the authenticity of our space. And for me, that is absolutely evident within, you know, art practices, that kind of subjectivity and that kind of voice. So for everything I do with regards to the practice and like the method of thinking, of peering and looking at how others are observing their space, my reaction is almost organic. So the way in which I contribute to, you know, building out Tilting Axis and the ethos of the Tilting Axis is just that. It's a response to the needs that come up within our cultural space.
Mario, you are also a curator, as well as a researcher in the area of the indigenous art. And as you've mentioned before, as we've mentioned before earlier in the conversation, you were also president of Res Artistes up until recently. How do your specific interests, both with indigenous practices and as a curator, and as and your interest in residencies, how do those specific interests inform Tilting Axis?
Yeah, I mean, I came to Res Artistes from my work with this place called the Longhouse Education and Cultural Center, which is an institution that's focused on promoting Native arts and nurturing the professional development of Native artists. And we set up a residency and to provide a safe space for exchanges between Native nation to Native nation. So these are reciprocal residencies that are for Native artists only. And through that work, I got involved with, you know, this network, and and quickly realized, personally, I had realized the value of cultural exchange, but also the way in which mobility. I personally, of course, I've also, as an immigrant to the U.S., I know the challenges of the restraints on mobility, and they become greater as day by day. But so the wealth that is gained by mobility, especially for an artist, is invaluable, right? And people often refer to things like cultural capital, right? So in many ways, I could say that I'm a cultural capitalist in that I'm very invested in not only the wealth that it brings to me, but also to others in terms of what you gain by traveling elsewhere and engaging other landscapes, other people, other communities. So that's been the thing that's driven me, and that's how I got engaged with Tilting Axis, through a project that Annalee had going on in terms of mapping the cultural resources of the Caribbean. And that's something that we were doing with Res Artis. We were trying to map the residencies globally. And so that for me is really important. Mobility as a human right, this is something that the UN has declared, and that I think we as Res Artis advocate strongly, and the wealth that's gained by cultural exchange.
Mm-hmm. Maybe each of you could weigh in on this question. The number of years you've each been working on or within the Caribbean visual arts sector varies, as well as the proximities within and out of the Caribbean you're each working at. All of these vary amongst the four committee members. And what is the state of the visual arts in the Caribbean now from your own individual perspective? And how does it compare to when you first started? Not necessarily when you first started Tilting Axis, but when you first started working within. For Mario, I guess it would be for when you first started working with Tilting Axis, because that might have been your first touch point in the Caribbean. But for Holly and Annalee, when you would have first started working professionally in the visual arts in the Caribbean, how does the state of the arts now compare to then? Maybe Annalee, we haven't really heard from you in a while. Could you maybe start off with that question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I came back from art school in like 89, and started I co-founded a union called Representing Artists that ran from 92 to 94. And in some ways I feel like Tilting Axis is a grown up version of that, because it was this really small, short-lived attempt that kind of blew up in a couple of years. But it was, I think, this vision about trying to function regionally, having an understanding about this. We've been trying to do this in the Caribbean for a long time, federation, which was, undermined and didn't happen, and then was sort of trumped by nationalism. But there was an attempt through a newsletter that we did to have articles written by people from the French, Spanish, and connect with the Dutch Caribbean. So there's constantly artists have been working to do that. What hasn't changed is the way in which the state in the Anglophone Caribbean responds to contemporary cultural practice, I think, is still very amateur. And so the living example of that right now is Carry Festa, which, it's not managed in the way that it should be. It hasn't grown up, and it hasn't become the professional regional festival for the arts. It could be a powerhouse if it were completely overhauled. So, I mean, I feel that kind of I don't know, what's happening at the state level in terms of nurturing the arts hasn't shifted, I don't think, in a positive way. What's fantastic is that, there's a lot of great work being produced And I think that the artist-led initiatives are becoming more vocal and more powerful. And I think that for me is the change that's happening. I certainly feel less isolated. And the internet has obviously, it sounds ridiculous, but that's been an enormous change from the early 90s to now.
Yeah.
It's just ubiquitous and we can't imagine not having it. But that has made a lot of things different and possible.
Holly?
Yes, so I feel as though the shift for me has been enormous. I came back into the region in 2010. I founded ARC with Nadia Huggins, who is also from St. Vincent. And we had a really unique opportunity to travel across most of the Anglophone Caribbean. And it was like coming out of a certain darkness into light, and understanding the weight and the sort of timeline that we were, put on. So with our moving around and us being able to investigate the things that came before us, whether it be something like RA, like Annalee was alluding to a while ago, or initiatives like CCA 7 in Trinidad. From my perspective, the last 7 years have been, I think, one of increased agitation. I think artists have definitely have started to come to terms with how they can develop more potent and powerful communication to the outside world. And for me, that has really transformed my scope of interest and the research that I continue to do. Outside of the lack of support that continues and will continue until we start to really overhaul how we think about our industry. And I'm not sure how much power the informal arts networks would have to come up with any kind of potential argument for that kind of investment. The thing is that we're doing it. Yeah. The independence that we have now is kind of, for me, empowering. It is. I'm seeing the region shift and transform and morph and question itself. And without that visibility and without that connectivity, I don't think there would be that sense of questioning. And we get to see the unraveling, we get to see the confusion, we get to see the triumphs, and we get to celebrate it with others. So for me, as a cultural space, it is truly, truly rich.
Mario, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, briefly. I mean, I am an outsider. Although growing up in New York, I was, very much aware of the diaspora, right? I mean, the presence of Puerto Rican, Dominican art, art and artists is prevalent in that space. But one of the things that I've noticed that I don't know if this is I don't know how to assess this difference, but I'm pretty sure this is a difference, and it's one that Holly described as a personal thing, and I think Annalee also would have a similar story in terms of they both went outside the region to get training and then have come back. And I think I've seen quite a bit of that. And I don't know if that's a very recent change, but I get the feeling that this is a substantial shift, and that people returning and operating within the region with the kind of the capital that they've gained outside is a substantial thing to note.
You're each coming from, Mario, as you said, you grew up in New York. Holly, you're from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Annalee, Barbados. How did you each meet, and how did you decide you'd collaborate on? I mean, I guess we know Holly and Annalee, you had been working on grants together, but how did you each meet?
Well, when we started ARC late 2010, we started to stalk people, doing a lot of research. Annalee's name came up pretty fast because we were trying to map the Southern Caribbean. for us, it was really important to go to sites unbeknownst to us, and to see how we can, develop like close working relationships. And of course, not all of them worked out, but in June of 2011 or July, yeah, June or July, we went to Fresh Milk to launch ARC #3, the 3rd issue. And Annalee and I started to produce the event, because she was also launching Fresh Milk. So, it was a joint initiative. And since then, a sister in the trenches. And I met Mario through Annalee in 2014. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, Annalee and I met in Brazil, at Video Brazil.
Oh, wow.
I think we had been, maybe, I don't know, Annalee, if we had been in contact before in terms of your mapping project and your a membership to ResArtis, but that was the moment in which we, kind of got to see a potential collaboration. Yeah.
Yeah. Fresh Milk had registered on the ResArtis platform. Yeah.
And you both sat on a panel recently at the School of Visual Arts in New York in the Curatorial Practice program, as well as art historian Erica James was also part of that panel, right? In the talk, Annalee, you stated most decisions about the Caribbean have been made externally, and you raised the how do we develop a healthy ecosystem from our position rather than external spaces making that decision about what is happening here. Why is this important to you? I mean, clearly I'm asking this. I know, I kind of know the answers because I'm also sort of working in the trenches here in the region, but why is this important to you, and how does Tilting Axis deal with this question specifically?
Well, I live here, right? So, I've been committed to this space for a long time, and the struggle is real in terms of issues around sustainability as a practicing visual artist. So I think, I mentioned at the last Tilting Axis, it's quite embarrassing that most of our funding comes from outside of the Caribbean. While we speak about being independent, many countries in the Caribbean are independent or post-colonial spaces, but we're making choices that don't necessarily support or invest in our own contemporary cultural practice. And so for me, it's important because I've seen as a tutor at the Barbados Community College that within a year of graduating, we have an attrition rate of almost 100%, which means that students who are mostly coming from, middle class or working class backgrounds, don't have the economic capacity to continue making work. And so we lose that talent, and their issues of brain drain are real, but just not being able to function in this space. So I live here, and I think that we are contributing to a healthier ecosystem through Tilting Axis, through Caribbean Link, through Fresh Milk, through ARC, NLS, Alice Yard, Tembe. I think that we're doing that, and it's important because it's where I don't want to be anywhere else. I'm committed to this space, and I'm committed to these people that I'm working with, to all of you that I'm speaking with now. And yeah, I want it to be a better space.
But isn't it sort of doesn't it sort of speak for the advances or successes of Tilting Axis and the visual arts sector that this funding is coming from outside of the region, considering that, in terms of the direction that resources generally flow between the Caribbean and areas outside of the Caribbean? I mean, is it?
Yeah, I think that is good. For me, it's really important that the Perez Art Museum wants to work with us. It's important that these entities value what we're doing. What I'm saying is that equally, we also in the Caribbean, at the state, the private and the informal sector, we also need to value what we're doing and put our money where our mouth is and invest in it. How is it, for example, in another sector that in Jamaica, in the last half of the 20th century, they have produced 6 to 8 new musical genres, and there isn't, like a performing hall. How is it that I don't have a national gallery? There is simply not a professional space for me to show my work in Barbados as a contemporary practitioner. And so this gap develops between your local audience and your practitioners when there aren't spaces to platform that work. So we now create new models to be able to do that, you know, through NLS or, you know, interventions in different kinds of ways so that we can benefit from and learn about. And that's where the internet has become so important for what we're doing. But I guess if we're committed to the space, that's why it's important. We live here. I live here.
Anybody else wants to weigh in on that one? No? Holly, there are a number of artist-led initiatives across the Caribbean. As we've all been mentioning, what's the significance of this, do you think? Maybe Annalee, you'd be able to give more of a time-based analysis of whether there have been more artist-led initiatives cropping up now, or whether this has been like a consistent development across the Caribbean. What is the significance of these artist-led initiatives and the function of these types of spaces? Could you get into a little bit more of that? Practically and culturally, what are the function of these spaces, and has this influenced Tilting Axis?
There was an address sent from an informal art space called Social Kitchen back in 2013. They operate out of Kyoto, Japan, and they sent out a bunch of questions to the world from a small social and cultural center in Far East Asia. And for me, going through that report and that announcement,
I saw that same announcement. It came in through eFlux, I think.
Yeah.
And it changed my life. I have to, my cultural life, absolutely, because it began to get to the question of relevance and to the question of operating within a context that's beneficial for your space. So for me, the burgeoning of these informal artist networks, they really pay testament to the time that we're in. These spaces work to enrich and enliven their local spaces. They work to counter loneliness, the loneliness that many artists feel. They're convivial, so they generate new ideas, new models, and I think at times they work in reactionary ways to whatever is happening on the ground. And I can't state how important this is, to have these neutral spaces that allow for that kind of investment and development. As somebody who has a good understanding, because these informal networks started to pop up from 2006 with I guess before 2006 with CCA, but I want to highlight 2006 as a pivotal moment with the sort of beginning of Aliciad, the galvanized turning into Aliciad, and then in this 10-year period, we've had so many of them generate, and I feel like when I look at our space and when I see how it's working to affect the intellectual capacity of our young artists, it is quite an achievement to know that we're all giving and sacrificing, but then we feed ourselves in return when we see these beautiful projects come to life, when we see people become connected, when other things are generated out of this. And now I think we're beginning to see another shift where people are looking and they're starting to invest from the inside and from the outside. And I would say that this investment is key to that longevity, and because we can't keep pushing up against nothingness. So the fact that these spaces contribute to a different ecology, it's paramount to the work that we continue to do with Tilting Axis, because without them, without the core, you have to remember as well, Tilting Axis was birthed out of these 2 meetings of Fresh Milk and ARC.
2 artist-led initiatives.
Yeah. So we can't move away from that because it's the origin. It locates itself in the center of all of it.
Yeah, and you mentioned the ecology of the region. These artist-led initiatives have really created a whole new ecology for the Caribbean that might not really have been so articulated at all before.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So Mario, Holly, Annalee, as we kind of close out, what do you hope for the visual arts in the Caribbean and the future of Tilting Axis? What are your hopes? Mario, I mean, Mario, you kind of are, as you say, you seem to be very self-conscious of being an outsider. So outside of
it's a safe space to occupy. Well, I'll start so that I don't have the final word, but I'll have to say that that what I hope is that this trajectory continues. I think one of the things that as we plan our next meetings, we're facing, or at least I am facing, is this a kind of frustration with the lack of capacity. Because I mean, we've through these different meetings, we've come up with lots of great ideas and kind of identified very specific areas that need to be worked on and developed. I think in the first meeting we actually were able to think about those three, areas that we thought we would then devote attention to. I think it was mobility, like art,
education,
writing, or education, and production. But I think despite that frustration of lack of capacity, I think that there's that the discourse itself is good work, and I think it is having impacts that we probably don't see or not yet. And so I just hope, what I'm hoping is that we continue to do this, and that and that it continues to serve a good purpose. Yeah.
Yes, I echo that sentiment of figuring out how we can thrive, how we can all thrive within this new motion, and thinking about the visual arts in the Caribbean, to see how within my very, very short time of observing it and being a participant, I want to see it continue to flourish, to bloom, to be. And I think for Tilting Axis, I always want us to keep on, questioning our intentions, really looking into the conditions of this space and responding accordingly with authenticity. And I think that kind of deep listening, a deep nuanced listening, would prevent us from, making the mistake of being out of touch. Mm-hmm. So that usefulness that Mario spoke towards, I echo it 100%.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I would say that, of course, we want sustainability around Tilting Axis. We'd love the fellowship to continue. Holly and I work with Elvis Lopez on Caribbean Linked. His Atelier 89 is one of the older kind of artist-led initiatives out of Aruba. So I think it's about sustainability for these things. I mean, I certainly am so richly fed by these convenings. And I feel very proud of the intellectual rigor and the commitment, and I feel that we too can be excellent, in the Caribbean in what we're doing. And those moments at Tilting Axis or Caribbean Linked or, different things that are happening around the Caribbean, I feel very proud that we have the capacity to produce great work. And people that came into Tilting Axis this year from, reputable international organizations were, really impressed by and intrigued and interested in the discourse that was happening. So I just hope that we continue to grow the Tilting Axis community and all of these various projects we're working on, and that we just continue having fun, because it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's been really, I've had the privilege of being witness to the growth, the inception and the growth of Tilting Axis, and it's been really wonderful being there for these 3 years now. You're going into the 4th year, so I'm wishing you all the best in the project, and it really has had an impact on the region in its relatively short duration. So we hope to.
And the work that you're doing with this, Deborah, is also so important. Like this archive that you're building of conversations and tapping into different practices and ideas and thinking is so crucial. So it's and we're so grateful to be a part of this. But the work you're doing is really significant. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you for taking the time to be on, and yeah, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you. Okay, bye.
Bye.